What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version of jungle warfare found in textbooks or official press briefings. According to declassified after-action reports and sniper testimonies recorded years after the fact, there were nights in Southeast Asia when the environment itself became hostile, deliberate, suffocating, and lethal. Not because it moved, but because it hid everything else. Military records describe it clinically: low visibility conditions, humidity saturation, fog density exceeding operational parameters. The men who lived through it used different words. They called it being blind while fully awake. Pay close attention now, because this is the side of war few are willing to discuss. Not the firefights. Not the body counts. But the hours of silence, when nothing happened, and everything could happen at once. Deep in contested jungle zones, U.S. forest snipers were deployed far ahead of main units. Their role was simple on paper: observe, report, eliminate high-value targets if necessary. But at night, when the fog rolled in unnaturally thick, simplicity vanished. Visibility collapsed to mere feet. Sound no longer traveled straight, it bent, echoed, lied. A snapped twig could be 10 meters away, or right behind you. In these conditions, the fog stopped being weather. It became terrain. Then psychology. Then a weapon. Veterans would later say the fog felt intentional. As if it arrived with purpose. Not drifting in, but closing around them, sealing exits, erasing landmarks they had memorized in daylight. The jungle they had trained to read leaf patterns, shadows, wind movement was suddenly unreadable. And a sniper without visibility is no longer a hunter. He is a listener. A guesser. A man alone with his breathing. This is where the psychological preparation began to crack. Training manuals taught patience, discipline, trigger control. They did not prepare soldiers for the sensation of being watched without the ability to confirm it. For hours, sometimes entire nights, snipers lay motionless as condensation soaked their uniforms and rifles alike. Moisture crept into optics. Sweat mixed with fog until it was impossible to tell where the body ended and the air began. One veteran described it this way: you couldn't see the jungle. You could only feel it pressing in. This is important to understand, because fear didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated. The fog erased distance. Without distance, threat felt immediate. Constant. Omnipresent. Every sound suggested movement. Every movement suggested contact. And every imagined contact triggered a physiological response: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, microtremors in the hands. Silent. Sudden. Fatal if you made the wrong call. As nights like this repeated, the fog evolved from an obstacle into a psychological battlefield. Hesitation became deadly. Overreaction became just as lethal. Some snipers fired at shadows and lived with the consequences. Others held fire too long and never left their position. This is where our list begins. Not with weapons or enemies, but with environments that killed without touching you. The first and most pervasive of these was the fog itself, the most silent, invisible, and psychologically corrosive force these men faced. It didn't announce contact. It didn't retreat. It simply stayed. Hour after hour. Night after night. And by the time dawn burned it away, something else remained. The damage. By the second week operating under these conditions, something subtle began to fail: not equipment, not discipline, but perception itself. According to field logs, patrol commanders noticed changes in sniper behavior long before any official incident occurred. Reports mentioned increased radio hesitancy, delayed confirmations, aborted observation cycles without clear justification. On paper, these were minor deviations. In reality, they were early signs of cognitive overload. Because the fog didn't just block vision. It rewired decision-making. In normal conditions, a sniper's world is built on distance and certainty. You identify. You confirm. You calculate. You act. Every step reinforces control. But in the fog, those steps collapsed into one terrifying question. Is what I'm sensing real or imagined? pay close attention here, because this is where fear stopped being emotional and became neurological. Dense jungle fog altered sound propagation. Veterans described voices seeming closer than they were, footsteps looping unnaturally, insects sounding like breathing. The brain, deprived of visual confirmation, tried to compensate. It filled gaps. Sometimes correctly. Often not. One sniper later testified that he tracked a set of footsteps for over an hour, slow, deliberate, pacing his position. Only at dawn did he realize the sound had been his own blood pulsing in his ears, amplified by the stillness. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought terror. Because if your own body could deceive you, what else couldn't you trust? This was the second element of the psychological battlefield, sensory betrayal. Military psychologists reviewing post-operation interviews noted a recurring phrase: nothing lined up anymore. Time felt distorted. Minutes stretched. Hours vanished. Men reported entire segments of the night they could not recall clearly, only fragments. A sound. A smell. A sudden spike of adrenaline with no identifiable cause. In these moments, instinct overrode training. An instinct, under prolonged stress, is unpredictable. One documented incident involved a sniper team positioned near a known infiltration route. Fog density was extreme. Radio contact was minimal to avoid detection. Near midnight, one sniper perceived movement, slow, crouched, deliberate. He raised his rifle but hesitated. No confirmation. No silhouette. Just presence. He waited. Minutes later, the movement came again, closer this time. The sniper fired. At dawn, the body was recovered. Friendly forces. Misrouted. Silent. Dead. No enemy contact occurred that night. The fog had claimed another victim without firing a single round. This is where command began to understand something disturbing: the environment was reshaping the rules of engagement faster than doctrine could adapt. Fog didn't just obscure the enemy. It removed the moral clarity soldiers relied on to survive psychologically. Kill when necessary. Hold when uncertain. But what if uncertainty was constant? Over time, snipers developed coping mechanisms. Some counted breaths to anchor reality. Others pressed fingers into the soil to confirm physical presence. A few whispered landmarks to themselves: tree line, creek bed, incline, trying to reconstruct a mental map in a world that no longer matched memory. Yet none of these strategies fully worked. Because the fog erased reference points. And without reference points, fear becomes internalized. It turns inward. It stops reacting to stimuli and begins anticipating catastrophe. This was no longer about combat stress. This was about erosion. Erosion of confidence. Erosion of trust. Erosion of self. And as the nights continued, a more dangerous pattern emerged, one that would permanently mark many of these men long after Southeast Asia faded from headlines. The third stage was approaching. By the time these fog-bound deployments became routine, fear had stopped announcing itself. It no longer arrived as panic. It arrived as patience. Military psychologists reviewing sniper after-action narratives noticed a disturbing shift. Early reports described tension, hypervigilance, adrenaline spikes. Later ones described something colder: emotional flattening. The men weren't reacting anymore. They were bracing. This is the third element of the fog battlefield: anticipatory dread. In the jungle, anticipation is normally a survival advantage. You predict movement. You read patterns. You prepare. But in the fog, anticipation had no anchor. There were no patterns, only possibilities. Infinite, unresolved possibilities. Snipers began preparing not for contact, but for failure. Failure to identify. Failure to react in time. Failure to live with whatever decision came next. One veteran recalled lying prone for 9 consecutive hours, unmoving, as fog condensed on his eyelashes and rifle barrel. He never saw an enemy. He never heard a confirmed sound. But his muscles cramped from restraint, his jaw locked from clenching, and his mind rehearsed death scenarios on a loop. Not his own death. Someone else's. This is where the psychological toll deepened. Fear was no longer sharp. It was dull. Constant. Like pressure at the back of the skull that never released. The fog amplified isolation. Snipers were already separated by distance and silence. In low visibility conditions, even the idea of support became abstract. You knew help existed somewhere. You just couldn't imagine reaching it in time. Radio discipline meant long gaps without confirmation. No voices. No reassurance. Just static when you dared to check. And static, in the fog, sounded like breathing. One declassified testimony describes a sniper convinced that someone was exhaling inches from his ear. He remained motionless, finger indexed along the trigger guard, heart rate so elevated he feared it would give away his position. After nearly 20 minutes, the sound stopped. He never discovered its source. The human brain is not designed for unresolved threats. When danger cannot be confirmed or denied, it lingers. It embeds. It trains the mind to expect catastrophe even in its absence. This is how fear learned to wait. Veterans later described returning home and reacting violently to mundane stimuli: steam rising from showers, morning mist on highways, condensation on windows. Their bodies responded before their minds could intervene. Because their nervous systems had been conditioned in the fog. In Southeast Asia, some snipers began to prefer daylight engagements not because they were safer, but because they were real. Daylight offered clarity, confirmation, the ability to assign meaning to what you perceived. At night, in the fog, meaning dissolved. Another incident illustrates the cost of this anticipatory dread. A sniper team, exhausted and operating beyond recommended psychological endurance limits, aborted a mission after repeated false positive detections. Command later confirmed enemy movement had been present but hours earlier. The fog had delayed certainty long enough to neutralize the mission. No shots fired. No casualties reported. Yet the operation failed. This was the fog's most insidious effect. It didn't just kill men. It reshaped outcomes. It altered history quietly, invisibly, leaving no clear enemy to blame. And when men cannot assign blame, they assign it to themselves. As weeks turned into months, these silent failures accumulated. Confidence fractured. Decision-making slowed. Some snipers requested reassignment without explanation. Others stayed and paid a heavier price. The fourth element was emerging now. More unpredictable. More damaging. The moment when silence itself became unbearable. By this stage, the fog no longer needed to be present to exert its influence. That is the most dangerous transformation of all. Military psychiatrists later identified this phase as environmental imprinting, when a specific condition permanently alters threat perception. For the forest snipers of Southeast Asia, the fog became internalized. Even on clear nights, their bodies behaved as if visibility were collapsing. Heart rate spiked without cause. Muscles locked into readiness. Breathing became controlled, shallow, automatic. Silence itself had become suspicious. This was the fourth element of the psychological battlefield: conditioned hypervigilance without stimulus. In operational terms, this was catastrophic. Snipers rely on calm precision. On emotional distance. On the ability to wait without deteriorating. But now, waiting caused deterioration. The absence of information was no longer neutral, it was threatening. One after-action psychological assessment described a sniper who reported relief when contact finally occurred. Not because he wanted violence, but because uncertainty had ended. The threat was finally real, visible, defined. That statement alarmed commanders. Because it meant the fog had reversed a fundamental survival instinct. The unknown had become worse than combat itself. In one lesser documented operation near a river basin, a sniper remained on overwatch during consecutive fog-heavy nights. No confirmed enemy movement. No engagement. On the fourth night, witnesses reported he began whispering aloud, narrating imagined movement patterns, assigning positions to enemies that were not there. He was extracted the next morning. No physical injuries. Declared combat ineffective. This wasn't weakness. It was exposure. Extended immersion in an environment where perception could not be trusted had fractured his cognitive filtering. The brain, desperate for resolution, manufactured threats to relieve tension. Fear demanded an object. When none appeared, the mind created one. This explains why some of the most enduring trauma reported by these snipers had nothing to do with killing or being shot at. It came from restraint. From nights where discipline prevented action, but instinct screamed for release. A nightmare you couldn't wake from. Even years later, veterans described the same recurring dream, lying prone, unable to move, surrounded by fog so dense it pressed against their chest. No enemy revealed themselves. No shot was fired. The dream always ended the same way, with the sensation of having missed something vital. A threat. A decision. A moment that could never be recovered. That sensation followed them home. Fog rolling across highways. Steam in factory floors. Morning mist in quiet suburbs. Their bodies reacted before memory could intervene. This is the damage that doesn't show on medical charts. By the time deployments ended, many of these men returned physically intact. But their internal threat detection systems were permanently recalibrated. Silence was no longer peaceful. Low visibility was no longer neutral. The fog had trained them to survive in a world where certainty did not exist. And survival came at a cost. The final element of this story is not found in the jungle. It appears afterward. In memory. In reflex. In the long silence that followed the war. What makes these operations so difficult to document is not the absence of data, but the absence of language. There are experiences that resist clean classification. They don't fit casualty statistics. They don't show up in victory reports. And yet, they persist longer than any firefight. This is the final element of the fog battlefield, the war that continued after the environment was gone. When these snipers returned home, the jungle stayed behind. The humidity. The insects. The constant wet decay of vegetation. All of it disappeared. But the psychological architecture built inside the fog remained intact. Veterans described reintegration as disorienting rather than relieving. Open spaces felt exposed. Clear air felt unnatural. Silence, stripped of its jungle context, became unbearable. Many slept with lights on. Others positioned themselves instinctively near walls, corners, exits. Habits formed during nights when visibility was measured in inches. According to post-war psychological assessments, a significant number of these men displayed symptoms that did not fully align with traditional combat trauma. There were no singular moments of horror to anchor memory. No explosive event. No clear trigger. Instead, there was accumulation. Night after night of unresolved threat. Decision after decision made without confirmation. Fear sustained without release. The fog had taught their nervous systems that danger did not announce itself. So even decades later, danger felt imminent everywhere. One veteran explained it simply, "I was always waiting for something to finish happening." That sentence appears again and again in testimony transcripts. Waiting. Watching. Listening. Even in peace. This is why these operations remain lesser documented. The damage they caused was subtle. Psychological. Slow. Hard to measure. And difficult to explain to those who had never lain motionless in a jungle while the world disappeared around them. There are no monuments to fog. No medals for nights when nothing happened, but everything could have. And yet, the men who endured those conditions carried something rare and heavy. An intimate understanding of uncertainty. Of restraint under unbearable pressure. Of surviving not through action but through control. The fog eventually lifted in Southeast Asia. Sunlight burned it away each morning, revealing terrain that looked harmless in daylight. Ordinary. Almost peaceful. But for those who had watched and waited inside it, the fog never truly left. It followed them. In memory. In instinct. In the way their eyes still search shadows instinctively, even now. This story is not about tactics or enemies. It is about environments that rewrite the human mind and the men who endured them in silence. Respectfully.